You see, it's so easy to stumble over Jesus. Because Jesus comes and doesn't do what we wanted. Jesus comes and doesn't do what we expected. And so we're like, Jesus, what gives? I thought you were going to make it all better. Jesus says, just like Isaiah, blessed are those who do not stumble over me. See, I think the reason we misunderstand the Beatitudes is not because they're hard to understand. I think we miss them because we don't want to hear what Jesus is saying. You know, I used to work at a large social service agency here in San Diego County. Worked there for about 4 years, big social services agency. One of my jobs, among other things, was to connect with volunteers, recruit volunteers in the community, that sort of thing. And so I'd often show up at the different locations for this social service agency, and I'd visit with the volunteers. And one of my favorite volunteers to visit with was an old woman in her 80s named Jillian. Jillian worked at one of the service centers here in Oceanside. And when I would show up, Jillian was one of those volunteers who, she wasn't getting paid to be there, but man, she was the queen bee in that place. She ran that place. You know what I mean? She was there 3 days a week, 8 hours a day, sitting at her cubicle, helping to process people who are struggling and poor and help them connect with the resources they needed. She was basically a volunteer social worker. Old, fiery woman, I think in her early 80s, I would guess. And I'd show up, and every time I'd come in, she'd say, Jason, sit down. She'd make me sit at her cubicle, and then she would proceed to interrogate me, what's going on at the home office? Why is this stupid decision being made? Why is that stupid decision being made? She would grill me, and I would be responsive to her questions because it felt like she was my boss. One day she said, kind of out of the blue, she said, where do you live? I said, actually, I just live right up the street, right up here in Fire Mountain, because the service center was right at the base of where we live, which is in Fire Mountain. I said, yeah, we live right up the street in Fire Mountain. She said, oh, I love that neighborhood. She said, back in the 50s, my husband and I tried to buy a house in that neighborhood, but they wouldn't let us. Because Jillian and her husband are black. And that was the first time I came to understand about redlining. Now, maybe you know about redlining. Redlining was a policy in the United States and Canada back in the 50s and 60s where banks and savings and loans wouldn't loan to black families if they wanted to buy in certain neighborhoods. The insurance companies wouldn't insure them if they wanted to live in certain neighborhoods. People wouldn't lend to businesses in certain neighborhoods. It was actually a systematic policy of making sure that black families and families of color didn't live in the same neighborhoods as white families. To make sure that white-collar families had their own neighborhoods with the best possible conditions that were separated from other kinds of people. This is, of course, a consequence of racism in the United States. I don't know if you know this, but we have a race problem in the United States. And it is the consequence of the fact that for 400 years, if you're a black person in this country, then you are subject to all kinds of injustices, not just slavery, but segregation, systematic oppression, lynchings, miseducation laws. Redlining was just sort of the latest manifestation of that racism that runs through our nation. Now imagine, if you could, if a leader arose in the United States today who said that they were going to right all of the historical wrongs and injustices that this country had committed over the past 400 years against people of color. Alex shared with me this morning an article that was in the New York Times last week. There's a seminary in Virginia called Virginia Theological Seminary, a seminary in Virginia that was built on slave labor. They actually had a slave quarters on campus, and many of the buildings there were built by slaves. And one of the reasons why Virginia Theological Seminary thrived in the first 30 years of its existence was because they took advantage of the slave labor that was available to them. And so just recently, Virginia Theological Seminary has decided that it will create its own reparations fund. They've put $1.7 million in a fund, and they're hoping to grow that fund so that they can do things like provide for the basic needs of the ancestors of slaves in their area. They can provide for tuition and housing for the ancestors of slaves in their area. This is just their attempt to try to right that historical wrong in their institution. And I'm all for that. Now, just imagine if a national leader arose in the United States who said that they were going to right all of the racial wrongs in this country. And when they started to speak, what they said was something along the lines of, "Blessed are those of you who are black, for your vindication is coming. Blessed are those who our ancestors lived in chains, for you will finally be free. Blessed are those who are discriminated against, for you shall be favored among all people." That's really what the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 are. It's not a list of spiritual virtues. It is a prophetic declaration that those who have been cursed, those who have been oppressed, those who have been wronged are now about to enter into their liberation because the Spirit of God is upon us to bring good news to the poor, the recovery of sight for the blind, and freedom for the captives. Now, I think we don't hear it that way for a bunch of reasons. And one of those reasons is because, frankly, most of us in this room have never really been oppressed. Most of us in this room don't know what it's like to face that kind of systemic, total, dehumanizing evil. Some of you do, but most of us don't. And those of us who don't know what that's like don't want Jesus to be saying that. You know, Luke announced a moment ago that on October 5th, there's going to be a meeting at St. John Missionary Baptist Church, and that our congressman, Mike Levin, will be there to hear from people about what we think needs to be done. And I would just like to point this out to you, that St. John Missionary Baptist Church is an historically black congregation in this community, number one. Number two, their main concern is lack of affordable housing for their own congregants who have historically been subject to racist laws and policies like redlining and have been denied access to build genuine wealth and well-being for themselves because of those laws. You know, the very best way for any American to build a life for themselves and have access to the resources they need is home ownership. And the third thing I want you to know is that Jillian, the woman that I told you about a moment ago, who her and her husband were denied the opportunity to buy a home in my neighborhood in the 1950s, that's her church. That's her church. It's a church full of people who have been denied access to the things that they need. So you better believe that I'm going to take my fair-skinned body over there and do whatever I can to advocate for that community. Because that's what it means to be a follower of Christ. It doesn't just mean to be willing to deal with your personal sins. It means to enter into the tradition of the Beatitudes that declares that those who have been cursed now have the opportunity to be set free by the Spirit of God.